Have you ever stood at a funeral and felt your entire body scream that something was terribly, horribly wrong? That moment when every instinct you possess tells you to speak up, even though hundreds of eyes will turn toward you in shock and disgust? Well, that's exactly where I found myself on a cold November morning, standing at the graveside of Victoria Ashford, the CEO of Nexus Technologies, and the woman who had changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and what I'm about to tell you is the truth about what happened that day. The truth that nearly got me killed. The truth that exposed one of the most elaborate corporate conspiracies in modern history. And the truth that still haunts my dreams every single night. When I screamed those 4 words, "Don't bury her," at the most powerful gathering of business elites in the city, I didn't know if I was saving a life or destroying my own. But I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that Victoria Ashford was not dead. And if I stayed silent, I would become complicit in whatever nightmare was unfolding before my eyes. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment I first walked into the glass and steel tower of Nexus Technologies 3 years ago. I was 26 years old, fresh out of business school with a mountain of student debt and a desperate need to prove myself in the cutthroat world of corporate finance. Victoria Ashford was already a legend in the industry, a self-made billionaire who had built her tech empire from nothing, a woman who was equally feared and admired, someone who could destroy your career with a single word or elevate you to heights you never dreamed possible. I remember the day of my interview like it was yesterday, not because I was particularly nervous, but because of the way Victoria looked at me when I walked into her office. Most powerful executives barely glance at entry-level candidates, but Victoria studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness. She asked me one question during that entire interview. Just one. "Sarah, what would you do if you discovered your company was built on a lie?" I didn't know it then, but that question would become the defining moment of my entire life. I answered honestly, perhaps stupidly, that I would expose the truth regardless of the consequences, because integrity was worth more than any paycheck. Victoria smiled at me then, a sad, knowing smile that I would come to recognize over the years, and she said, "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. You're hired, but remember this conversation, Sarah. One day you might have to make good on those words." Working for Victoria was unlike anything I had ever experienced. She wasn't just my boss. She became my mentor, my friend, and in many ways, the mother figure I had lost when I was 16. Victoria saw potential in me that I didn't see in myself, and she pushed me harder than anyone ever had. Within 6 months, I had been promoted from junior analyst to her personal assistant, a position that gave me access to every aspect of her life and business. I saw the woman behind the legend, the brilliant strategist who worked 18-hour days, the philanthropist who secretly donated millions to causes she believed in, the vulnerable human being who sometimes sat in her office at midnight, staring at old photographs with tears streaming down her face. Victoria trusted me with her secrets, her fears, and her dreams, and I would have done anything to protect her. We became so close that people in the office whispered about favoritism, but Victoria didn't care about office politics. She once told me that in her 30 years of building Nexus Technologies, she had learned that true loyalty was rarer than diamonds, and when you found someone you could trust completely, you held on to them with everything you had. I didn't understand the full weight of those words until much later, when I realized that Victoria had been preparing me for something, training me for a role I never asked for but would be forced to play. The year before Victoria's supposed death was marked by subtle changes that I noticed but couldn't quite interpret at the time. She became more secretive, more paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder as if she expected someone to appear from the shadows. Board meetings became tense battlegrounds where Victoria fought with increasing desperation against proposals she claimed would destroy everything we've built. I remember one particularly heated exchange where Maxwell Hartley, the chief financial officer and Victoria's longtime business partner, accused her of being unstable and paranoid, suggesting that perhaps it was time for her to step down and let younger, clearer minds take over the company. Victoria's response was chilling. She stood up, placed both hands on the conference table, and said, "Maxwell, if anything happens to me, if I die under even slightly suspicious circumstances, I want everyone in this room to remember this moment. I want you to remember that I explicitly stated I am not suicidal, I am not careless, and I am not going to have a convenient accident. Do you all understand me?" The room fell completely silent, and I felt ice water run through my veins. What did she know? What was she afraid of? When I asked her about it later that day, she squeezed my hand and said, "Sarah, I need you to promise me something. If anything happens to me, don't believe the official story. No matter what they tell you, no matter how convincing it seems, You have to dig deeper. Can you promise me that? I promised, though I thought she was being unnecessarily dramatic. How could I have known that within 8 months I would be standing at her funeral, about to scream accusations at some of the most powerful people in the country? The day Victoria died, or supposedly died, started like any other Tuesday. She had a morning meeting with the board, lunch with a potential investor, and an afternoon schedule packed with phone calls and contract reviews. I had laid out her agenda the night before, as I always did, and everything seemed perfectly normal. But Victoria never made it to her morning meeting. At 7:45 a.m., I received a phone call from Maxwell Hartley, his voice shaking with what sounded like genuine grief, telling me that Victoria had been found dead in her home, an apparent suicide by overdose of sleeping pills. I dropped the phone, my entire world shattering into pieces that I knew could never be put back together. Suicide? Victoria? The woman who fought for everything she had, who never gave up even when the odds were impossibly stacked against her, who had explicitly told her board of directors that she was not suicidal just months earlier? Nothing about this made sense, but I was so overwhelmed with grief that I couldn't think clearly, couldn't process the massive red flags that should have been obvious to anyone who truly knew Victoria Ashford. The company immediately went into crisis management mode, with Maxwell stepping up as interim CEO and controlling every aspect of the narrative. The official statement released to the press painted Victoria as a troubled genius who had been struggling with depression and the immense pressures of running a multi-billion-dollar company. They spoke of her in past tense, as if she was already a historical figure, rather than a living, breathing woman, who had been laughing at my terrible jokes just 48 hours earlier. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday, just 4 days after her death, which seemed unusually fast to me, but I was told that Victoria had left specific instructions about wanting a quick private ceremony. The service was held at Greenlawn Cemetery, an exclusive burial ground where titans of industry were laid to rest among marble monuments and ancient oak trees. Hundreds of people attended: board members, business partners, politicians, celebrities, all dressed in expensive black and wearing expressions of calculated grief. I stood near the back, unable to bear being close to the casket, unable to look at the glossy cherry wood box that supposedly contained the woman who had meant everything to me. The minister spoke in platitudes about Victoria's legacy, about her contributions to technology and society, about how she would be remembered as a visionary. But his words felt hollow, scripted, as if someone had written them without ever knowing who Victoria really was. Maxwell gave the eulogy, his voice breaking at appropriate moments, his eyes glistening with what looked like tears but felt somehow wrong, somehow false. He spoke about Victoria's brilliance, her dedication, her lonely struggle with inner demons that none of them had fully understood. Every word he said made me angrier, made the knot in my stomach tighten until I thought I might be sick right there on the perfectly manicured grass. This wasn't Victoria's story. This was a carefully constructed lie designed to bury the truth along with her body. As the ceremony progressed toward the burial, I found myself edging closer to the grave, some magnetic force pulling me forward even though I wanted to run away, to escape this nightmare that couldn't possibly be real. The pallbearers, 6 men from Nexus Technologies' security team, all of whom I recognized, carried the casket toward the open grave with synchronized precision. That's when I saw it, the detail that would change everything, the small but impossible anomaly that made my blood run cold, and my mind start racing through everything I knew about Victoria, about her death, about the entire situation. The casket seemed too light. I had been to enough funerals in my life to know how pallbearers move when they're carrying a body, the way their shoulders strain under the weight, the careful, heavy steps they take to maintain balance. But these men were walking almost normally, their shoulders relaxed, their steps casual, as if they were carrying something far lighter than a human body. My heart began to pound so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the minister's final prayers. Could it be? Would they dare? I thought about Victoria's paranoia, her warnings, her explicit statement that if she died, we shouldn't believe the official story. I thought about how quickly everything had happened, how controlled every aspect of this funeral felt, how Maxwell had taken over the company with barely a hiccup, despite the supposedly devastating loss of their founder and CEO. My legs started moving before my brain fully caught up with what I was doing. I pushed through the crowd of mourners, ignoring the surprised gasps and angry mutters as I shoved past millionaires and politicians. The pallbearers had just positioned the casket on the lowering device above the grave, and the minister was beginning the final blessing when I reached the edge of the gathering. Time seemed to slow down as I opened my mouth, as I prepared to either save a life or destroy my own credibility forever. "Stop!" The word came out as a strangled shout, not as authoritative as I had hoped, and not everyone heard me over the minister's voice. But I was committed now, past the point of no return. I pushed forward again, breaking through the front row of mourners until I was standing right at the edge of the grave, right next to the casket that was about to be lowered into the earth. "Don't bury her!" I screamed, my voice cracking with emotion and desperation. The minister stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in shock. Every head turned toward me, hundreds of eyes focusing on the young woman who had just interrupted one of the most high-profile funerals of the year. Maxwell Hartley's face went from pale to red in an instant, his expression morphing from surprise to fury. "Sarah, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, moving toward me with clear intent to remove me from the scene. "This casket is too light," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "I've been watching the pallbearers, and they're not carrying the weight of a body. There's no way Victoria is in there." The silence that followed my accusation was absolute, the kind of silence that feels like pressure against your eardrums, like the world itself is holding its breath waiting to see what happens next. I could see the calculations happening behind Maxwell's eyes, could see security personnel beginning to move toward me from the edges of the crowd, but I also saw something else, a flicker of fear in Maxwell's face, a momentary crack in his composed facade that told me I was right, that I had stumbled onto something much bigger and more dangerous than I had imagined. "You're clearly distraught, Sarah," Maxwell said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone as he addressed the crowd as much as me. "Victoria's death has affected all of us, but some of us are handling it better than others. This young woman was very close to Victoria, and grief can make us believe irrational things." He nodded to the security team, who began closing in on me from both sides. But I wasn't done, and I knew that if they removed me now, if they buried that casket without opening it, the truth, whatever it was, would be lost forever. "Then open it," I challenged, my voice ringing out across the cemetery. "If I'm just a grief-stricken employee having a breakdown, if Victoria is really in that casket, then open it and prove me wrong. What harm could it do? But if you refuse, if you have me dragged away and that casket buried without anyone verifying its contents, then everyone here will know that I was right to question this." I could see the crowd beginning to murmur, could see doubt spreading across faces that had been composed in respectful mourning just moments before. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to trust your instincts completely, even when every logical person around you thought you were crazy? Comment below and tell me about it, because I need to know I'm not the only one who's ever felt this kind of desperate certainty. Maxwell's face had gone from red to a strange mottled purple, and I could see a vein throbbing in his temple. He was trapped, caught between looking guilty by refusing my request and potentially exposing whatever conspiracy he was part of by agreeing to it. The standoff felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. Finally, it was Victoria's younger brother, James, who stepped forward from the crowd. James and Victoria had a complicated relationship. He had never been involved in the business, had lived off a trust fund for most of his adult life, and I knew Victoria had been disappointed in his lack of ambition. But in that moment, James showed more courage than I had ever given him credit for. "Open the casket," he said quietly but firmly. "Sarah has the right to see her. We all have the right to confirm that we're burying the correct person. There's been enough mystery surrounding my sister's death. Let's have some clarity, at least in this." Maxwell tried to argue, claiming it was disrespectful to Victoria's memory, that it would be traumatic for everyone present, that it violated the sanctity of the funeral service. But James held firm, and other voices began joining his. Victoria's college roommate, a few board members who I knew had been loyal to Victoria rather than to Maxwell, even some journalists who had been invited to cover the funeral and now smelled a much bigger story. The pressure became too much, and Maxwell finally, reluctantly, nodded to the funeral director. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Open it. But when this turns out to be exactly what we all know it is, a grieving employee having a very public breakdown, I expect everyone here to respect Victoria's memory by never speaking of this incident again." The funeral director, a thin man in his 60s who looked like he had seen everything in his long career but never quite this, moved toward the casket with visible reluctance. His hand shook as he reached for the latches, and I realized that he was genuinely afraid of what we might find, or might not find, inside. The sound of the latches clicking open was obscenely loud in the cemetery silence, each click like a gunshot that made people flinch. I held my breath, my fingernails digging into my palms so hard I would later find crescent-shaped cuts in my skin. The lid began to rise, and I prepared myself for 3 possibilities. Victoria's body, confirming that I had made a terrible career-ending mistake. An empty casket, proving I was right but opening up a whole new nightmare of questions. Or something else, something I couldn't even imagine, but that my instincts told me was possible in this impossible situation. What I saw when that lid fully opened made my knees buckle, made several people in the crowd gasp or cry out, and made Maxwell Hartley turn and try to run before security personnel, the real ones, not his hand-picked team, grabbed him. The casket wasn't empty, but it didn't contain Victoria either. Inside, carefully arranged to approximate the weight and shape of a human body, were bags of sand, dozens of them, positioned around a store mannequin dressed in one of Victoria's favorite suits. The mannequin's face was covered with a silk cloth, presumably so that any quick glance would register as a body prepared for burial, but anyone who actually looked at the figure would immediately recognize it as a fake. Chaos erupted. People were shouting. Phones were coming out to document this impossible scene. Security was trying to control the crowd while simultaneously trying to apprehend Maxwell and several other Nexus executives who were attempting to flee. I stood there in shock, vindicated, but also terrified. Because if Victoria wasn't in that casket, then where was she? Was she alive? Was she dead somewhere else, her real body hidden while this elaborate fake funeral played out? And most importantly, why? What could possibly be worth staging the death of one of the most famous business leaders in the country? James grabbed my arm, his face pale with shock and confusion. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? Where's my sister?" I didn't have an answer for him, not yet, but I knew that I had just exposed the tip of something massive, something that went far beyond a simple corporate power grab. As police arrived on the scene and began taking statements, as journalists scrambled to report this stunning development, as the carefully orchestrated funeral dissolved into pandemonium, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and saw a text message from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "Find me. V." My heart stopped, then started again, racing so fast I thought I might faint. Victoria was alive, and she needed my help. The nightmare wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The days following the funeral disaster were a blur of police interviews, media attention, and threats that came from directions I never saw coming. The story exploded across every news outlet in the country. Tech CEO's funeral exposed as elaborate hoax. Nexus Technologies' scandal deepens as executive bodies discovered what really happened to Victoria Ashford. I was suddenly famous in the worst possible way. My face plastered across television screens and websites. My life dissected by strangers who had never met Victoria and had no idea what we were really dealing with. The police investigation moved slowly, frustratingly so, because Maxwell and his co-conspirators had lawyers, expensive ones, and they weren't talking. But I had something the police didn't have, that text message from Victoria, and an intimate knowledge of how her mind worked. If she was alive and in hiding, if she had faked her own death and allowed this elaborate charade to play out, she must have had a reason, and she must have left me clues about where to find her. I spent my nights going through 3 years of memories, conversations, private jokes, trying to figure out where Victoria might have gone to ground. She once told me about a cabin her grandfather had built in the mountains of North Carolina, a place so remote that it didn't appear on any maps, a place she went to when the pressure of running Nexus became too much. "It's my secret sanctuary," she had said, making me promise never to tell anyone about it. "If I ever disappear, Sarah, if I ever need to vanish from the world for a while, that's where I'll go." At the time, I thought she was being dramatic, maybe even a little paranoid. Now I realized she had been planning for exactly this situation. But I couldn't just drive to North Carolina and start searching random mountains for an unmapped cabin. I needed more information, and I needed to understand what Victoria was running from, or what she was trying to accomplish, by staging her own death. The answer came from an unexpected source. Victoria's personal lawyer, a sharp woman in her 70s named Eleanor Winters, who had handled Victoria's affairs for over 2 decades. Eleanor contacted me through a secure email account, asking to meet at a public place where we could talk without being overheard or recorded. We met at a busy coffee shop downtown, and Eleanor slid a sealed envelope across the table to me. "Victoria gave me this 6 months ago," Eleanor said, her voice low and urgent. "She told me to give it to you if anything happened to her and only to you. She said you would know what to do with the information inside." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and began reading Victoria's handwritten letter. The words on those pages revealed a conspiracy so vast, so corrupt, that I understood immediately why Victoria had been forced to fake her death. Nexus Technologies, the company she had built from nothing, had been infiltrated years ago by a shadowy network of investors who were using the company's advanced technology for illegal surveillance, data manipulation, and activities that bordered on domestic terrorism. Victoria had discovered the infiltration 18 months before her supposed death, and she had been gathering evidence, building a case that would expose not just the criminals who had hijacked her company, but also the government officials and law enforcement personnel who were either complicit or being blackmailed into silence. The letter explained everything: the paranoia, the warnings, the tense board meetings where Maxwell and others had tried to push Victoria out. They knew she was onto them, and they knew that if she went public with what she had discovered, dozens of powerful people would go to prison, and the entire technology sector would face massive scrutiny and regulation. So they had decided to eliminate her, to stage her suicide in a way that would be believable, and would allow them to seize control of Nexus without anyone asking difficult questions. But Victoria had been one step ahead of them. She had anticipated the attempt on her life, had prepared her own counterplan, and on the morning of her supposed death, she had fled to her grandfather's cabin with the help of a few people she trusted absolutely, people whose names she didn't include in the letter because she didn't want to put them at risk. The fake body in the casket had been her idea, a way to buy time while she organized the evidence and figured out who in law enforcement could be trusted with the truth. Sarah, the letter continued in Victoria's distinctive handwriting, by the time you read this, you will have already proven yourself to be exactly the person I always believed you were. You stopped the burial, you asked questions when everyone else accepted the convenient lie, and now you need to finish what I started. I'm including a location in this letter, coordinates that will lead you to me. But before you come, you need to understand the danger you're walking into. The people who tried to kill me will not hesitate to kill you too, and they have resources that make them nearly impossible to escape. If you decide not to come, I'll understand. You've already done more than I had any right to ask. But if you do come, bring the evidence I've hidden in my office. You'll know where to find it. And prepare yourself for a fight that will change both of our lives forever. Finding the evidence Victoria had hidden in her office turned out to be easier than I expected, because Victoria and I had played a game for years where we would hide notes for each other in ridiculous places and see how long it took the other person to find them. Her office had been sealed by the police as part of the investigation, but I still had my security clearance, and I told the officer stationed outside that I needed to retrieve some personal items that belonged to me. Inside Victoria's office, everything looked exactly as she had left it. The awards on the walls, the family photos on her desk, the expensive leather chair where she had sat during our countless conversations about business, life, and the future we were building together. I walked to the bookshelf where Victoria kept her collection of first edition novels, found the copy of Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier that I knew was her favorite, and opened it to the inscription page. Taped inside was a small USB drive, so tiny it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. I pocketed the drive, my heart hammering, and left the office before anyone could ask me what I had really been doing there. That night, I looked at the coordinates Victoria had included in her letter and began planning the most dangerous road trip of my life. The drive to North Carolina took 12 hours, and I spent every minute of it checking my rearview mirror, convinced I was being followed. Convinced that Maxwell's people or the corrupt investors or whoever else wanted Victoria dead would stop me before I could reach her. But I made it to the small mountain town nearest to the coordinates without incident, checked into a motel under a fake name, and prepared for the hike that would take me to Victoria's cabin. The trail was exactly as Victoria had described it in our long-ago conversation, barely visible, winding through dense forests that seemed untouched by human hands for decades. I hiked for 3 hours, following the coordinates on my phone, jumping at every sound, imagining threats behind every tree. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, and I was starting to panic that I had gotten lost, I saw it. A small log cabin nestled in a clearing, smoke rising from its chimney, looking like something out of a fairy tale. I approached cautiously, my entire body tense with anticipation and fear. Before I could knock, the door opened, and there she was, Victoria Ashford, alive. Thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, but unmistakably, beautifully alive. We stared at each other for a moment that felt suspended in time, and then I was crying, and she was crying, and we were hugging each other so tightly that I couldn't tell where I ended, and she began. "You did it," Victoria whispered against my hair. "You brilliant, brave, insane woman, you actually did it. You exposed the fake funeral, you found my letter, you brought the evidence. Sarah, you saved my life and you don't even know it yet. I pulled back, wiping tears from my face, trying to compose myself enough to speak coherently. Victoria, what the hell is going on? Who tried to kill you? What's on this USB drive? And how are we going to fix this nightmare? Victoria's expression became serious. The vulnerability of our reunion replaced by the focused intensity I recognized from 1,000 business meetings. Come inside, she said. We have a lot to discuss and not much time to do it. Inside the cabin, Victoria had set up what looked like a war room. Laptops, papers covered in notes, charts mapping out connections between people and companies, evidence of months of investigation and planning. She made us both coffee, and then she began to explain the full scope of what she had uncovered. Nexus Technologies' advanced artificial intelligence and data analytics platforms, the technology that had made the company billions of dollars and had made Victoria a legend in the industry, had been weaponized by a group of investors who called themselves the Convergence. These people, Victoria explained, weren't just wealthy. They were true believers in a twisted ideology that saw democracy as inefficient and believed that a small group of enlightened elites should control society through manipulation of information and technology. They had been using Nexus's AI to conduct illegal surveillance on millions of people, to manipulate social media algorithms in ways that shaped public opinion, to gather blackmail material on politicians and business leaders, and to identify potential threats to their agenda before those threats could gain traction. Victoria had discovered the Convergence's activities by accident, when she noticed anomalies in Nexus's server usage and began investigating on her own. What she found was horrifying. Her company, her life's work, had been turned into a tool of oppression and control. She had spent months gathering evidence, creating backups, preparing to expose everything. But the Convergence had figured out what she was doing, and they had decided to eliminate her. The plan had been simple. Make her death look like a suicide, blame it on the stress of running a major company, and use the tragedy to push through changes in Nexus's leadership that would give the Convergence complete control. But I had been preparing for them, Victoria said, her voice hard with determination. I had been planning my own death for months, gathering resources, setting up this safe house, recruiting a small team of people I could trust absolutely. When I learned they were going to move against me, I activated my plan. I faked my own death, with the help of a brilliant makeup artist and a doctor who owed me a favor, and disappeared. The body they found in my home that morning was actually a medical-grade mannequin, good enough to fool a cursory examination, but not good enough to survive an actual autopsy. I knew they would want to avoid an autopsy, that they would push for quick cremation or burial, and I was counting on someone, on you, Sarah, to notice something was wrong and stop the burial before my body was destroyed. I sat there overwhelmed by the scale of what Victoria had orchestrated, by the risks she had taken, by the trust she had placed in me. The funeral, I said slowly, understanding clicking into place. The casket being too light, that wasn't an accident. You knew I would notice, knew I would say something. Victoria nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. I knew you, Sarah. I knew your integrity, your attention to detail, your inability to stay quiet when something felt wrong. I gambled everything on you being exactly who I believed you were, and you came through. Now we have a chance to finish this, to expose the Convergence and take back my company. But it's going to be dangerous, more dangerous than anything either of us has ever done. Are you ready for this? I thought about everything Victoria had told me, about the conspiracy we were up against, about the powerful people who would do anything to keep their crimes hidden. I thought about how much easier it would be to walk away, to return to my normal life, to pretend I had never received that text message or found that cabin. But then I looked at Victoria, at the woman who had believed in me when no one else did, who had invested in my potential, who had trusted me with the truth that could change everything. There was only one answer I could give. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of my life. Victoria and I worked 18-hour days in that cabin, going through the evidence she had compiled, organizing it into a case that could be presented to authorities we could trust, identifying journalists who had the courage and resources to break a story this big. The USB drive I had retrieved from Victoria's office contained encrypted files with years of communications between Convergence members, financial records showing illegal transactions, and even video evidence of their meetings where they openly discussed their plans to manipulate elections and control government policy. It was overwhelming, damning, and absolutely terrifying. We knew that once we went public with this information, our lives would never be the same. The Convergence wouldn't just give up. They would fight back with everything they had, using their money, their connections, and their willingness to do violence to silence us permanently. Victoria and I spent long nights talking about whether we were making the right choice, whether the potential good of exposing the truth was worth the certain danger we would face. But every time we wavered, every time we considered backing down, we would look at the evidence of what the convergence had done, the lives they had ruined, the democratic processes they had corrupted, the technology they had twisted for their own purposes, and we knew we had no choice but to move forward. The world deserved to know the truth, no matter what it cost us. We finally decided to coordinate a simultaneous release of the evidence to multiple outlets: major newspapers, investigative journalism websites, law enforcement agencies at both the state and federal level, and even international organizations that could bring pressure if the U.S. authorities tried to bury the story. Victoria had been in contact with several FBI agents who specialized in corporate fraud and who had reputations for integrity that couldn't be bought. We arranged to meet with them in a secure location, bringing physical copies of the evidence as well as detailed testimony about everything Victoria had discovered. The meeting took place in a nondescript office building in Washington, D.C., and I was terrified the entire time that we were walking into a trap, that the convergence had somehow learned about our plans and was waiting to eliminate us both. But the agents were legitimate, and when they saw the evidence Victoria presented, I watched their expressions transform from skepticism to shock to grim determination. "This is going to blow up everything," one of the agents said, flipping through page after page of documented crimes. "You understand that, right? This isn't just about your company. This touches senators, judges, media executives, tech industry leaders all over the country. When this goes public, the fallout is going to be massive." Victoria met the agent's eyes with the steely confidence I had always admired. "Good," she said simply. "It should be massive. These people have been operating in the shadows for too long, corrupting everything they touch. It's time for the truth to see daylight, whatever the consequences." The day the story broke was surreal. I woke up in a FBI safe house where Victoria and I had been moved for our protection, turned on the television, and saw our faces everywhere. "Tech CEO faked death to expose corporate conspiracy," the headlines screamed. "Nexus Technologies at center of illegal surveillance scheme," another read. My phone, a new one provided by the FBI, was flooded with messages from friends, family, former colleagues, all asking if the news was true, if I was okay, if I had really exposed this massive criminal enterprise. The journalists we had worked with had done their job brilliantly, breaking down the complex evidence into stories that the public could understand, connecting the dots between the convergence's activities and real-world events that had seemed random or coincidental, but now revealed a disturbing pattern of manipulation. Within hours, arrests began. Maxwell Hartley was taken into custody at Nexus headquarters, along with 3 other board members who had been working with the convergence. Warrants were issued for dozens of other individuals: investors, tech executives, even a few government officials whose names I recognized from the news. The scale of the takedown was unprecedented, and I felt a mixture of triumph and terror watching it unfold on live television. Victoria sat beside me on the couch in that safe house, her hand gripping mine, both of us processing the magnitude of what we had accomplished. "We did it," I whispered, almost unable to believe it. "We actually did it." Victoria turned to me and I saw tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, of vindication, of hope that maybe, just maybe, we had made a difference. "No, Sarah," she said firmly. "You did it. Without you, I would be buried in that fake grave and the convergence would still be operating with impunity. You saved my life, you helped expose the truth, and you never wavered even when it would have been so much easier to walk away. You are the hero of this story." The legal proceedings that followed took over a year. Victoria and I spent months giving depositions, testifying in court, working with prosecutors to build cases against every member of the convergence we could identify. It was exhausting, often frightening. We received death threats regularly, had to live with security details, had to watch our backs every moment of every day. But we also witnessed justice being served in a way that restored some of my faith in the system. Maxwell Hartley was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. Other convergence members received similar sentences, and while I'm sure some of them escaped justice, people with that much money and power usually do, we knew we had dealt a serious blow to their organization. Nexus Technologies underwent a complete restructuring, with Victoria returning as CEO and implementing new oversight and transparency measures to ensure the company could never be hijacked again. She offered me any position I wanted in the company, but I surprised both of us by declining. The experience had changed me. had shown me that I wanted to do something different with my life. I enrolled in law school, determined to specialize in corporate ethics and whistleblower protection, wanting to help other people who found themselves in the impossible situation of choosing between their career and doing what was right. Looking back now, 3 years after that November morning when I stood at a graveside and screamed that something was wrong, I'm still processing everything that happened. The trauma doesn't just go away because you win, because justice is served, because you survive. I still have nightmares about that funeral, about the moment the casket opened and I saw the mannequin inside, about the weeks in hiding when every sound could have been an assassin coming for us. But I also have moments of profound gratitude. Gratitude that I trusted my instincts, that I had the courage to speak up when silence would have been easier, that I had a mentor like Victoria who believed in me enough to bet her life on my integrity. The story became a sensation, spawned books and documentaries and even a movie deal that Victoria and I are consulting on. We joke sometimes about who should play us in the film, but underneath the jokes is a serious understanding that our story matters, that it represents something important about the power of individuals to stand against corruption, about the importance of asking questions even when everyone else accepts convenient lies. Victoria and I are still close. She's still my mentor, my friend, and now also my partner in a foundation we started together to support whistleblowers and protect people who expose corporate wrongdoing. We meet every week for coffee, and sometimes we talk about the past, about those terrifying days in the cabin, about the moment we decided to expose everything. But more often, we talk about the future, about the work we're doing to make sure what happened at Nexus can never happen again. I want to take a moment to talk to you directly, whoever you are watching this video right now. If there's one thing I learned from this experience, it's that your instincts matter, your voice matters, and your willingness to question what everyone else accepts without thinking can literally change the world. I could have stayed silent at that funeral. I could have ignored the small detail of the casket being too light, could have told myself I was imagining things, could have chosen my career and my comfort over the truth, and if I had made that choice, Victoria would be remembered as a suicide, the convergence would still be operating, and countless lives would continue to be damaged by their corruption. But I didn't stay silent, and that made all the difference. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, but everyone around you was accepting it as normal? Have you ever had to choose between speaking up and staying quiet, between your security and your integrity? Share your story in the comments below, because these conversations matter. Because knowing we're not alone in facing these impossible choices gives us strength. And I want to emphasize something crucial. Understanding content like this, understanding the importance of questioning authority and trusting your instincts, is not just interesting, it's potentially life-saving. The ability to recognize when something doesn't add up, to push back against convenient narratives, to demand evidence and transparency, these are skills that every person needs in our complex, often deliberately deceptive world. If this story resonated with you, if Victoria's courage and the eventual exposure of the truth moved you in any way, please take a moment to leave a like on this video. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. More people who might be facing their own moment of decision where they have to choose between silence and truth. And if you want to see more stories like this, more real accounts of people who stood up against powerful forces and lived to tell about it, subscribe to I Lived to Tell right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're committed to sharing stories that matter, stories that inspire, stories that remind us all that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept lies and corruption. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and remember, your voice matters more than you know.